medieval torture. Nothing says civilization quite like iron spikes and a room full of screams. Forget the chivalric romance. The Middle Ages had more in common with a butcher's workshop than a bard's ballad. And if you want to know how power really works, don't look at the crown, look at the rack. Let's start with the heretic's fork. Elegant in its stupidity. 2 prongs, one jammed under the chin, one pressed up into the sternum. Strapped tight with a leather collar so if your head droops from exhaustion or prayer, or the unbearable weight of being painfully alive, the fork stab you. Not to death, that would be mercy. Just enough to keep your posture excellent and your repentance sincere. Used often by the Inquisition, who figured God might appreciate a little neck torture to go with the theology. Dominican friars were fond of it. They called it persuasio. We might call it motivational skewering. Now imagine a heavy iron pear. Looks harmless if you're into garden tools and trauma, but this one opens. 4 petals, hinged like the gates of hell, expanding outward. It was inserted into the mouth, or the vagina, or the anus depending on the nature of your supposed sins, then cranked open slowly, like some blasphemous fruit blooming inside you. Its nickname? The pear of anguish, used generously in France and Italy, usually for women accused of witchcraft or sex crimes, which, conveniently, were often the same thing. One German account describes a midwife forced to bite down on the device while being questioned about demonic childbirth. She confessed. Of course she did. Let's take a walk through 14th century England. The air smells of dung, burnt fat, and wet wool, which is to say, normal. In the market square of Leicester, a man is being flayed alive. Not a metaphor. His skin is being removed in strips, publicly, by the order of King Edward II. His crime? Cutting royal cloth with a short measure. A tailor, cheating inches. The punishment was a message. The king's fabric is holy, and your flesh is less valuable than thread. Chronicler Thomas Walsingham describes spectators laughing and retching in equal parts. A fair summary of most medieval justice. And speaking of fairness, let's talk ordeal by water. Here's how you determine if someone's guilty. You tie them up and throw them into a river. If they float, they're guilty. The pure water rejects them. If they sink, they're innocent. Briefly, this was actual legal procedure. Papal authorities eventually tried to outlaw it in the 13th century, citing, quote, a regrettable failure in divine logic. But villagers across Europe kept doing it anyway, often with the same enthusiasm as you might toss a rock in a pond, especially for suspected witches, who, being already socially soggy, were expected to drown cleanly. Then there's the iron chair. Picture this: a throne, bristling with spikes on every inch of its surface. The arms, the seat, the backrest, the footrest, even the headrest, because why not? You'd be stripped naked and strapped into it, slowly, sometimes heated from below with coals, because comfort wasn't the point. The idea wasn't to kill you, not right away. It was to make sitting feel like being digested, popular in the Holy Roman Empire, a favorite among Bavarian interrogators. And before you get smug, ask yourself if you've ever sat in an office chair for 10 hours a day and called it just part of the job. Let's get intimate now with the strappado, used by everyone from the Spanish Inquisition to Florentine city guards. It's simple, brutal, and reliable. You tie the prisoner's hands behind their back, then hoist them up by a rope attached to the wrists, high, until the joints start to whisper secrets, then drop. Not all the way. Just a sudden spine-snapping jerk that dislocates both shoulders instantly. If you were lucky, it ended there. If you weren't, they did it again and again. There's a 1,476 record from Milan of a man who endured 12 drops before naming names. All of them were wrong. But that wasn't the point. The point was theater, pain as confession, suffering as spectacle. But nothing says public entertainment quite like the breaking wheel, the Catherine wheel, named not for a saint but for what it did to your limbs. You were tied to a cartwheel, arms and legs spread wide. Then the executioner, who, in fairness, had a strong arm and a worse conscience, smashed your bones with an iron bar, one by one. There was a rhythm to it. Thigh, shin, forearm, elbow, repeat. Sometimes they broke the limbs in between the spokes, then wove them through the gaps like macabre origami. Left you there to die, or just to inspire civic morality. It was used well into the 18th century. Enlightenment thinkers, after all, still needed reminders of order. In Avignon, 1310, a nun named Marguerite Porete was burned alive, not for heresy in the usual way. She didn't claim to be God or boil babies. She wrote a book, The Mirror of Simple Souls. It suggested that true union with the divine didn't require the church, just personal annihilation. Spiritual, not physical, but the Inquisition preferred the latter. She was gagged, stripped, chained to a stake, and lit up in front of a jeering crowd. The Paris court record calls her a delirious blasphemer. Her only words before the flames reached her hair were, reportedly, "I belong to love." In a world ruled by fire, even metaphor could get you immolated. Back to England. Let's visit the Tower of London, 1581. The air is thick with soot and secrets. A man named Edmund Campion is being racked, not once, not twice, but 4 times in 1 week. A Catholic priest in a Protestant kingdom, he refused to renounce Rome. The rack, that cheerful invention of stretching a human body until it separates like pulled pork, was used with surgical timing. Ligaments first, then tendons, then joints. Campion couldn't lift a hand by the end, but his interrogator noted, no defect in his wit. That's one way to admire your victim after turning his bones into wet ropes. And then there's impalement. Oh yes, the granddaddy of medieval statements. A sharpened pole, a body, gravity. Introduced anally or vaginally, the weight of the victim slowly forced the pole upward, through organs, through muscle, through time itself. Vlad the Impaler made it famous, but it wasn't his invention. The Byzantines did it, the Ottomans did it, even the Normans had their fun. It took hours to die, sometimes a day. If the spike was smooth and the angle just right, you'd live long enough to see your own guts twitch. One Hungarian record boasts of a man surviving impalement for 3 days. I suppose that counts as endurance. Or a failure of design. But here's the thing, torture wasn't just about punishment. It was communication, a language of bodies, translated into fear. Every spike, every burn, every shriek, it told the crowd, this is what happens if you forget who's in charge. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography, pain with a purpose. Torture had rules. At least, that's what they told themselves. In the dusty margins of a 13th century Parisian legal handbook, there's a note in Latin, tormentum debet esse moderatum. Torture must be moderate. That's the legal equivalent of saying a volcano should be temperate. But the phrase was important not because it was followed, but because it was cited. Judges could only authorize torture if they already had half proof of guilt. That meant rumors, bad dreams, or maybe your neighbor's pig sneezed when you walked past. In medieval logic, this was admissible evidence. Take the thumbscrew, a charming little device, easily portable, which could turn bone into powder with the twist of a screw. Used widely in Scotland and the Low Countries' polite societies that appreciated precision. The best models were German, naturally, made of wrought iron and shaped to fit snugly around the thumb or big toe. Applied gradually, with the interrogator watching your face for twitches, not out of empathy, mind you, but to judge how close you were to confessing that you danced with the devil on Whitsunday. Many did. Most lied. That was fine. Truth was flexible when the bone was soft. There's a record from Lubeck, 1412, of a merchant accused of coin-clipping, a medieval economic sin so severe it could unbalance entire towns. They didn't hang him. They put him in the Spanish boot, a wooden or iron cuff clamped around the calf, into which wedges were slowly hammered, one at a time, until the shin bone cracked like dry bark. His confession under the fourth wedge included crimes he hadn't committed, and two, he couldn't have, given he'd been out of the country. He died of gangrene. The city council declared the confession valid but regrettable. Bureaucracy is eternal. Now let's revisit boiling. Yes, boiling. Not metaphorical, not symbolic, actual vats of bubbling liquid. England passed a specific statute for it in 1531 under Henry VIII, because apparently regular hangings weren't dramatic enough for poisoners. The law mandated that convicted poisoners be boiled alive in water or oil, pitch or lead. Thomas Culpeper, a cook, was the first, tossed into a cauldron outside Smithfield. Chroniclers wrote that he roared like a bull, took nearly 2 hours. Londoners came from miles around. Vendors sold food. It was, quite literally, dinner and a show. Meanwhile, in the quiet cells of Montségur, the Cathars waited. Heretics, yes, but tidy ones. They rejected church hierarchy, material wealth, and the idea of purgatory. Big mistake. In 1244, after months under siege, 220 of them surrendered to French forces and were offered a deal: convert or burn. None converted. They were led to a giant wooden pyre and burned alive in a group. No torture devices needed. The fire did its job. But Inquisition records reveal a charming detail. The friars refused to let them speak to the crowd before burning, for fear the heretics might spread poetry. That's the kind of fear you only have when your God is nervous. Let's talk about the branks, also called the scold's bridle, a device made for women with loose tongues, meaning those who gossiped, argued, or spoke up. A metal cage fitted over the head with a flat iron plate that pressed into the mouth, sometimes spiked, to ensure silence. You couldn't speak, couldn't swallow properly, could barely breathe, but you could be paraded through town, publicly mocked, spat on, used heavily in 16th century Scotland, where female speech was classified as a civic nuisance. In Edinburgh, there's a record of one Margaret Fleming wearing it for 5 days. Her offense? Calling her neighbor a buggering thief. In fairness, he was, but truth was not a defense. Now step into the dungeons of Nuremberg, clean by medieval standards, professional even, and inside, a favorite among German interrogators, the Schandmantel, the coat of shame. It wasn't torture by tearing, it was humiliation by armor, a heavy metal cloak, often studded with bells or painted with lewd images, locked around the body, designed to crush your dignity rather than your limbs. You'd be made to stand in it, usually in the town square, often for hours, pee in it, faint in it, become a walking cautionary tale. Used mostly on prostitutes, blasphemers, and failed bakers. Yes, bakers. One Nuremberg account lists bread too light as grounds for punishment. Quality control has never been so medieval. You want psychological warfare? Let's go to the Vatican. Late 15th century. The Inquisition has perfected a technique called the question extraordinaire. The name alone should terrify you. It meant no holds barred, all devices legal, all methods authorized. They often used sensory deprivation, sleep starvation, and a rotating trio of tormentors who'd take turns keeping you conscious. Not to extract information, but to break the soul. In one case, a scribe recorded a man forgetting his own name, then confessing to crimes that hadn't been invented yet. When released, he died of thirst despite being surrounded by water. That's not a parable. That's paperwork. Now, rats. No, not the metaphorical kind. The literal ones. You'd be tied down, belly up, with a metal bucket placed over your stomach. Inside, a hungry rat. The torturer heats the bucket with coals. The rat, seeking escape, digs the only way it can, down, through you. There are surviving instructions for this in the Tower of London archives, complete with suggested durations and rat feeding schedules. In 1625, a Dutch mercenary confessed to treason after 6 minutes of this. Then he died. Not quickly, but again, speed was never the point. Here's a twist for you. Sometimes torture didn't look like torture. It looked like architecture. Take the oubliette, a French word meaning to forget. It was a tiny dungeon, often a pit, narrow and dark, where prisoners were dropped and left. No light, no space to stand or lie down, no sound but their own breath. Water might drip from the ceiling, or not. Food came once a week, if at all. There's a record from Chateau de Loche describing a nobleman who survived 3 years in one. When released, he couldn't speak, flinched at candlelight, and bid a bishop. I sympathize. But don't let the sadism distract you. Torture wasn't madness. It was systemic, organized, clerical. There were manuals, training, regulations. Some cities even had guilds of executioners, like the Meister Hans of Nuremberg, who kept meticulous diaries of each procedure. How tight to tie the rope, how long to turn the screws, when to stop and when not to. His notes are clinical, cold, and terrifying in their precision. One entry simply reads, "Girl, age unknown, cried until mute, confessed, then died. That's all, and that's everything." Torture, like any bureaucracy, was efficient, but its purpose wasn't to reveal truth. It was to affirm the authority of the interrogator. The body became a text written in bruises, broken bones, missing teeth, and every mark said the same thing: the system is right, you are not. We return now to France, 1389. A baker named Jehan de Letang is arrested in Rouen for selling underweight loaves. A petty crime, you'd think. But famine was nearby, and the price of bread was blood. His punishment wasn't a fine or prison. It was the pillory, but not just that. He was nailed to it, through the ears, literally affixed to the wooden board in the market square, forced to stand until the town bell rang vespers. If he tore free, he lost his ears. If he didn't, he stood there while flies laid eggs in his eyes. Chroniclers say Jehan learned to measure flour more carefully. They always say that. The lesson is obedience, not baking. The Middle Ages weren't careless, they were calculated. Pain wasn't just an expression of rage, it was policy. Municipal law codes from Lubeck to Barcelona to York spelled out punishments in lurid detail. Half-hanging, tongue removal, cauterization with red-hot tongs, and always, always in public. Because private pain doesn't teach the same lesson, but public agony? That's a seminar. Everyone attends, whether they want to or not. But even the silence had its tortures. Ask the anchorites, medieval religious recluses who voluntarily walled themselves into tiny stone cells attached to churches. No exits, no windows, save a narrow slit for food. They chose this, for spiritual purification, they said. One woman, Christine Carpenter of Surrey, was enclosed for years. She later begged to be released. The bishop said no suffering was part of the deal. She escaped, was dragged back, and re-enclosed with stricter seals. A living tomb sanctioned by God. Torture dressed as devotion. And then there were the draconian amnesties. Yes, even mercy had teeth. In Florence, 1424, a thief named Matteo da Cortona was offered a pardon if he agreed to a light punishment. That meant being branded across the face with the city's seal, a lily. Hot iron, full force, right on the cheek. The chronicler Giovanni Villani described the sound as meat singing. Matteo screamed, "Yes, but it wasn't the pain that broke him. It was walking through the streets afterward. Every face turned, every child pointed, every mirror agreed. The city never let you forget its generosity." Let's talk about the trial by fire, another form of divine judgment. This one, at least, more theatrical. The accused had to walk a certain number of paces holding a red-hot iron bar, or walk barefoot over burning plowshares. If the burns healed cleanly in 3 days, you were innocent. If not, well, better luck next life. In 1020, Queen Emma of Normandy was accused of adultery and made to undergo this ordeal. She passed, which was suspicious in itself. There's evidence the test was rigged, the iron cooled beforehand, or the plowshares swapped. But that was the genius of medieval justice. Even cheating had rules. Some tortures were permanent, not in the doing, but in the result. Mutilation, as a form of civic bookkeeping. In Hungary, coin forgers had their hands chopped off and nailed to the city gates. In Venice, liars had their tongues cut out and displayed on hooks at the Rialto. In Krakow, thieves had their noses removed, the medieval version of a criminal record you couldn't erase. Your face became your file, and your file made you a warning. And just when you think you've heard the worst, consider the Iron Maiden, not the band, the sarcophagus. You've probably seen it in pop history, a human-sized coffin lined with spikes. Close it, and the points pierce your body not to kill, but to wound, to bleed, slowly. The problem? Most examples we have are 18th century fakes. There's no clear medieval record of it being used before the 1500s. But that tells you something too. Even centuries later, we were still inventing new ways to mythologize old pain. The idea was seductive. That's the real horror, not that it happened, but that we wanted it to. Because in the end, torture wasn't a failure of justice. It was justice, as they understood it. A justice rooted in visibility, spectacle, fear. Pain wasn't a side effect. It was the point. The body was currency, and confession was the gold standard. But here's the twist. You think this world is over, that we're better now. We have laws, rights, cameras. The scaffold is gone, the pyres are out, the dungeons are museum pieces. But ask yourself, when a prisoner today is kept in solitary for 23 hours a day for years, with no trial, is that different or just cleaner? When pain is privatized, bureaucratized, outsourced, is that mercy or efficiency? The pillory was public. But now we scroll past mugshots on social feeds, turn shame into content, turn confessions into clicks. The Middle Ages nailed ears to wood. We just use headlines. They branded faces with iron. We do it with search engines. They believed pain revealed truth. So do we. We're just subtler about it. So before you laugh at the branks and the rack and the boiling cauldrons, ask yourself, if the medievals were monsters, what are we? Because they didn't hide what they were doing. And that might be the scariest torture of all.